All right, everyone, welcome. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm going to be your host, MC, and herder for the next hour. I'm very glad to see all of you here today. If you haven't been here before, welcome to the Shindig environment. If you would like to get a tour, we'll show you how it works in just 1 second. So if we can hit to the next slide, let me start giving you some background. First, you should know that the Future Trends Forum is an outgrowth of the Future Trends of Technology and Education report. That's a monthly project, a monthly report that surveys current trend lines in education and technology. If you haven't seen it before, go to ftte.us. You can find examples of recent and historical reports and subscribe. Now, we can't do this work without the help of generous sponsors, so I want to shout out to two of them before we begin. First, let me give thanks to NiserNet, which is a great networking outfit from New York State that works to bring together higher education institutions across that state. We're very grateful for their support. We're also grateful for the support of Shindig. Shindig provides us with two wonderful resources. One is this technology platform that we're using right now. The other is great people, people who help organize these events, who help support them and keep them going. And again, we're very, very grateful. We couldn't do it without you. Now, speaking of essential people, today we're going to be talking with Amy Collier from Middlebury College. But before I introduce Amy, let me just make sure everyone knows where we are in technology. So the top half of the screen, where I am and where this wonderful slide is called the stage. And this is the presentation spot. You all can see and hear everything that comes out of the stage. And some of you can join us. Explain that in a second. Down below, where all of you guys are where the audience lives. It's the participation swarm. And you can see up to about 16 people. Actually, there are many dozens of people who get to be on here. Whenever we have more than 16 at a time, up spawns another room, and we can have multiple rooms at the same time. Key thing is, bottom part of the screen is where all the audience gets to be. Now, if you would like to interact with us, there are four different ways you can do this, beyond listening and watching, which is great. At the very bottom of the screen, you should see two orange dots, which give you two powerful ways of connecting. The one on the left has a raised hand and the word raise. If you click that, that tells us that you'd like to come up on stage. So we can pull myself right off the stage and bring you up. So if your mic and camera are working and you're in a physical location where you can talk without overwhelmed by public noise, please, we'd love to hear from you. And this will happen in the course of the hour. Now, if you can't do that for whatever reason, you're shy or workplace or your camera isn't working, or you just prefer to type, that's fine. Click the other orange button that says ask. Type in a question or a comment, and we can flash it on the screen for everyone to see, and I'll read it out loud for everyone to hear. Now, if that isn't enough, if those aren't the only two options that are good for you, no problem. Head over to Twitter, where we have a conversation going using the hashtag FTTE. And you'll see that people will be issuing comments and questions, both people who are here in the forum and people who aren't logged in. Now, the other way you can comment is by chatting with people who have come into the Shindig environment with you. So if you just mouse over your cursor, you'll see a few different options. One of them says I am chat. Click that and you'll get a little text box that lets you chat with people who come into the Shindig environment with you. Now, not everyone can see that, but you can chat with people, ask questions, and share thoughts. So again, the key thing about the Future Trends Forum is that we want this to be as interactive, convivial, discussion-based as possible. So in order to exemplify that, let me stop talking and introduce Amy. Amy lives not too far from me in Middlebury College. She's the provost for digital learning. She runs a wonderful blog with a lot of great talks and comments like the Red Pen Cushion. Please follow that. And let me welcome Amy. It's so good to see you.
Brian, thank you for having me. This is so exciting. I'm really nervous, actually.
Oh no, well, don't have any stage fright for us, so I'll have to bring in more photos of cats.
Thank you.
I'm, I'm so glad to see you. Can you just to introduce yourself, can you just say a few words about what it is that you do at Middlebury College? What does it mean to be an associate provost of digital learning?
Well, it's a new position at Middlebury, so we're kind of making sense of that as we go. But the idea, Middlebury has an undergrad located in beautiful rural Vermont. We have schools abroad, at 9 of them, I believe. We have a school in Monterey called the Middlebury Institute for International Studies. at Monterey. We have Bread Loaf up in the mountains near you. And so we have all these component pieces that need or are exploring digital learning. And my job is to kind of look at the whole picture and to kind of help provide direction for what digital learning means for a place like Middlebury and all its many diverse programs, and to help set course for what we do in that space. So that's my job.
That's all. That's huge. That's huge.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask, just as part of that, I mean, knowing Middlebury as I do, and in Vermont as I do, you have an unusual emphasis on social media. You do a lot of your work online. Can you say a little bit about why you do that and what the benefits are?
I guess I began that back in 2008. I think because Twitter had just come onto the scene and I was exploring what that meant. And I started to think of it as a place where I could connect with other professionals and learn from them. And it wasn't until I went to a pod conference, oh gosh, about 6 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, I don't remember. And it became a way in which I connected to people and learned from them. And so I, I've been working my way through figuring out what it means to participate in networks like those, um, both the good and the bad associated with those. And I've made incredibly strong connections through social media, and I've used it to help bring depth to the work that I do, not just me personally, but also the groups that I work with. So back then, when I first started getting on social media, I was at Texas Wesleyan University, and we used it as a way to reach faculty, and we did in really creative ways. And so I've enjoyed doing that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And just in the run up to today, it was nice back and forth with you. Friends, if you aren't following Amy on Twitter, please do so. And also, definitely check out her blog. We're going to be referencing her blog over the next few minutes. Um, it seems like you have a job description and a job practice of the 21st century. It's marvelous.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we have so much to cover and so much to talk about based on the variety, depth, and creativity of your work. Let me just ask you to begin with. You and other people have been discussing the idea of critical instructional design as a topic. We're all, I think, pretty familiar with instructional design. We know that IDs are beginning to grow across higher education. But what does it mean to do critical instructional design?
So I had planned on answering that kind of straightforwardly, but I'm gonna actually I have a Tumblr full of words that I need to just get out. It's 2 days after an election that I'm struggling with the results. I know, I'm sorry, I had to bring it up. Um, and I feel like I will get to your question in just a second, but I have a Tumblr full of words I need to say. So I guess just what I want to say is that I think, and I think that this is part of the work that I feel called to do, is I think we need love more than ever, and we need resistance. And we need love as an act of resistance. We live in a world that isn't safe for a large number of our students, where our students are unsafe because of who they love or the color of their skin or who they worship or the anatomy and identity of their bodies. And this isn't new. I mean, let's not act shocked. This is not a new phenomenon, just very apparent these days. And we must love those students as an act of resistance. And we must resist alongside them and behind them. And as white educators, myself, I have to acknowledge that loving our students means we have to recognize our complicity in systemic and structural and blatant racism and classism and sexism in our educational system. So I'm calling for love as resistance, and that means being acknowledging and tearing all that down. We live in a world where Silicon Valley and its infiltration into education treats none of our students with respect, cares nothing about them and those experiences that I just talked about. And again, this isn't new. Let's not act shocked. This is not new this week. Um, the the things that they pay attention to don't fit into, or the things that the Silicon Valley don't pay attention to are things that don't fit into the algorithms, that don't fit into a dashboard, can't be commoditized, and therefore are left out of the conversation about what students need and benefit from. so many of the companies we work with treat students' data agency um, as disrespected, as dismissed, um, and all the while purporting to be the great equalizer for students and education. So, love as an act of resistance is not sitting back and watching this happen. It's not just being a soft shoulder or a distant ally. It's resistance. It's pushing back, and I feel like that's a lot of the work that we talk about when we talk about critical instructional design. I know a lot of people don't really connect with this idea of love and education. I get it. Some people say it's too touchy feely. Some say it's too intimate. I understand that. Um, I guess what I would just say, I could go a little bit into the background of my notion of love. I don't think I will because it'll actually probably make me cry. But I was just reading a transcript from one of my favorite podcasts on being, where Krista Tippett had Ruby Sales, who is a Civil War, or sorry, a civil rights activist. And Ruby Sales said, "Practical to being outraged. Let's be very clear about that. Love is not antithetical to anger. There are two kinds of anger. There's redemptive anger and there's non-redemptive anger. So redemptive anger is the anger that says that moves you to transformation, to human upbuilding. Um, and non-redemptive anger is what white supremacy has its roots in. So we have to make that distinction. And I feel like in many ways, when I talk about critical instructional design, um, I feel like it's rooted in the notion of love and questioning and the right kinds of anger towards what the kinds of tools we bring into our environment every day. The term critical instructional design was coined by Sean Michael Morris, who works with me at Middlebury. He's an instructional designer. And I would point you to Sean's blog post on it, and I think you've linked to our website, digitallearning.midcreate.net. On that, the most recent blog post is from Sean about this topic, and he basically is talking about how it's an approach to our work that has as its main tenet questioning and deconstructing, which you don't usually think of when you think of instructional design. And so those are practices that we think are really important in instructional design. My part of the conversation, so we presented about this last week at the Open Education Conference. Um, and my part of that conversation was about how leaders, people who run offices like mine, people who run IT offices or faculty development centers, things like that, um, how we can make space for critical instructional design in our offices, considering that it's not something that just everybody's accustomed to, or maybe even everyone's welcoming of. Um, there are days when I feel really optimistic about this work. There are days when I feel a lot less optimistic with this work. And I've seen people I admire greatly have tremendous success and also get pushed out or centered away from this work. So I feel like it's increasingly important today, this week, now, and I feel like we have to do it.
Well, I've just linked to the post you described, and I want to thank you for bringing us back to this seismic election, and for all the issues, the emotions, and the concepts that have swirled around it. And I would like to invite anybody present in this forum, if you would like to share your thoughts in the chat box, please feel free to, at the very, very least, and we can return to this. Because as Amy just brilliantly outlined in just a few seconds, really, there are so many connections between the issues that have surfaced along with the intersection of technology and education, ranging from the question of capital and its role, to how technology shapes learning and its affordances and its restrictions, to how we think about students and how we think about emotion. So first, thank you for that tumbler full of emotion, a tumbler full of words, as you said. Um, I linked out to Sean's post. Um, let me just, if I can press on that a bit more. When instructional design must deconstruct and interrogate, um, how does it connect with the idea of creation and building and making?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say probably a couple of ways, but one of them is that um, when you build something, when you create something, the creative act can sometimes, I think, because we love it or it's exciting and it's joyful, can sometimes maybe mask some of the assumptions behind that creative act. Can sometimes mask the things we believe are values, and maybe not mask necessarily in a negative way. Again, like this can be a really joyful process. Um, but I think it's easy to fall in love with what we create and to not always question even our own work in that area, our own creative work. So I would say a good pairing of creative work with deconstructive work can be, I think, a really fruitful set of activities. And it's certainly the case that, when Sean and Sonia, who's our other instructional designer, and I work with faculty and we take this kind of framework of critical instructional design, it's not, we're certainly building and co-building and thinking through that process in a constructive way. Um, but then we also um, not parrot, pair it with um, questions and historical notions. I think one of the things that I've been talking to people a lot lately, as I've been thinking about a vision for my organization and the work that we do, the three of us together, um, is that so much of the work that we do in technology offices and centers for teaching and learning is ahistorical. We don't spend a lot of time looking at where we came from and what's been done before and why. And I feel like we could do more of that work. And I like to think of instructional design as part of scholarship, not just scholarship in the moment, in the current, but also as scholarship of the past. And I think that's why Audrey Waters is such an important voice for higher education. She does such a phenomenal job of taking us through the history of many things that we see happening in Silicon Valley and education. And I really value that her voice is so important to the work that we do.
She was the first guest on the Future Transform. Um, let me,
Brilliant.
I have a question, but before I do, Stephen Smolnick has a question. Shindig folks, why don't you knock me off and bring Steve up on the stage so he can ask?
Hi, Stephen.
Brian, the last thing I'd ever want to do is knock you off. Just kidding. Hi, Amy. Hey, you mentioned a couple of things which brings to mind some other phrases. One of the things you mentioned is the idea of in our physical offices, making a space for critical instructional design. Now, I have to admit that the physical office space is maybe second in my consideration on instructional design and working with faculty. That's because I've been doing it online for so long. And I think of the virtual space. Could you talk a little bit about um, that collaboration as we go along and getting faculty used to what I'll call getting comfortable with the ambiguity? I think in some of either your postings or Sean's postings, there have been some notes about the ambiguity of those trying to design for the aha moments, which are serendipitous. And watching the learning happening, getting comfortable with the ambiguity, yet as instructors still feeling pressed to somehow measure or
Mm.
have a rubric ahead of time that's going to apply to this ambiguous situation. So I've loaded a lot in there, but I know you can run. Thanks.
Sure. I'm probably not going to be able to answer all that, so I will add a couple of things you said. Kind of. I'm sorry.
To what you'd like. It's a tossed salad.
Um, a couple of things you said kind of hit home for me. So I'll just kind of talk to those a little bit. When I talk about creating space for critical instructional design, I don't necessarily mean physical. And in fact, one of the things that I've really been learning a lot about lately, because Sean works remotely, he works from Portland, Oregon. So he's not only not physically co-located as a team member, he's on, however many, three time zones away. And so those are some, yeah, I can count today. Um, um, and I think one of the things that we've been learning about through the process of his being a remote instructional designer is exactly about what it means to have a relationship with a faculty member, partnership with a faculty member at a distance and try to do this work. And we've been doing it. He's done some blogging about this on our website. I've been doing some blogging about managing remote. As I mentioned in our introduction, Middlebury has all these different elements, programs across the world. And so remote work, remote collaboration is part of our DNA. And so we're really thinking deeply about that. And in fact, I was talking to Brian a little bit earlier. We're going to be hosting a community-initiated conversation, which is kind of a framework within our strategic planning process, where we're going to talk about remote work. We're going to get into the questions it raises, the intentionalities that you need in order to do it well, reflection and the empathy that needs to happen when you're doing that kind of work. So we're really kind of getting into the thick of it a little bit. And I think I know it has implications for how we talk about digital learning, because you could say that those kinds of distances that you might experience as a remote worker are the same kinds of things you might experience even if you're living in the same city but taking an online course or doing something in a hybrid way. And Sean and his colleague Jesse Stommel, our colleague Jesse Stommel, talk a lot about how all the work we do now is hybrid, that our lives are hybrid, and intentional approaches, critical and reflective approaches to that, I think are needed at our institutions, and we're trying to do some of that work. So I feel that actually that fits really nicely into the notion of critical instructional design. We've had a lot of conversations with colleagues here about questioning the practices of the different kinds of video conferencing meetings that we do, which we have to do because of the distance between our campuses, but we haven't maybe spent as much time as we need to really looking into it, asking what kinds of practices and approaches we need to take to do it well and to do it respectfully of each other. One of the conversations that I've been having with a colleague of mine, Jen Ross, for a long time now is around embodiment. I find I look at platforms like Shindig right now, and I sit here and question and kind of ask about the embodiment that's happening in this space right now. So it kind of stays with you once you start thinking about the embodiment in physical spaces and what that looks like and how to approach it. You come up with some really interesting questions.
Thanks. Thanks for your thoughts on that.
Amy, you mentioned Krista Tippett's On Being podcast. That used to be On Faith, I think.
Probably, yeah. She
Yeah,
comes from
yeah,
she's a minister or something like that. Her background is definitely
yeah.
of religious nature.
Oh,
And
just
I didn't say so in my Tumblr of words, but I almost talked about that I come from a very religious background, and it has shaped me, whether or not I'm still kind of involved in that world, which I would say I'm not. It has shaped me in ways that um, something about her podcast does really appeal to me. So it's wonderful,
cool. Well, it's
very
very
thoughtful.
inspirational. I often listen to it when I'm out working on the land, when I'm weeding or stacking wood or stacking stones.
It's good for all those
Michael,
flights from Vermont.
yes, yes. Michael, this is a fantastic question, and I love the way, Amy, that you get to unfold it in terms of what critical instructional design means. One point that you brought up, the kind of us living in this perpetually imbricated world of digital and physical, this is in many ways the world that's increasingly taking shape around us everywhere except most of Vermont, where we don't have good connectivity. Um, what do you think is the role of instructional design in helping people think more carefully, more richly, more critically about that intertwined virtual, physical, online, and offline world?
Yeah, I mean, um, I think that's just it. It's really about bringing, as I said, kind of historical notions of the intertwingling of, yes, the web is in the grand scheme of humanity fairly new, but the hybridity of our lives across many media and across, distance, that's not new, of course. And when I grew up in Brazil, I had pen pals. And yes, it's different. It's very different, but I think that historical perspective uh, can be really helpful in allowing people to think both, I think, more vividly about the work that they do in online spaces, because I think we tend to get kind of narrow. We see something, we see a MOOC, and we go, okay, well, online looks like that. And maybe online learning doesn't look like that at all. But we start to get kind of rigid in how we approach things or how we think about design. So historical, um, and honestly, I think bringing disciplinary context into our work really helps. I've said this before; it's kind of controversial, and I'm sorry. Um, I've said I've almost never hired an instructional design who has just a purely instructional design background, because I think that the um, the deep disciplinary backgrounds open up ways of thinking about things that are divergent. Um, and keep us from being group thinky about our work and too process oriented about our work. It brings kind of a level of more openness, I think, to the instructional design process.
Well, this brings me back to a question that came up based on something you said earlier, the question of disciplinarity. A couple of months ago, we had Eddie Maloney from Georgetown, and I actually have a visual aid. This is a glass cup. The same thing. This is awesome. So he was talking about the idea, as you know, of creating educational technology as an academic discipline. Um, and this is very controversial. This has won a lot of opposition and some support. And what you described seems to be a version of that, an interdisciplinary fusion, bringing together multiple disciplines in order to get more perspective on the field of instructional technology. Do you think going forward with the discipline is the right way?
This is such an interesting. I've gone back and forth on this. I was at that meeting with you where we talked about this, and I really struggle with this question. I'll say I don't have a good answer, but I will say from my personal experience, I have benefited tremendously from my graduate work as a sociologist. And both the work, I did a specialization in early childhood education, and I did a specialization in kind of qualitative research methodology. And those things bring a really broad lens that I value so much in the work I get to do. And I guess I just, interdisciplinary is good. I want that. Um, uh, I don't know about calling or like turning educational technology into a discipline itself. I'm not sure. Okay, I'll leave it ambiguous.
Well, that is ambiguous, but maybe ambiguity is the way forward for longer.
Maybe.
Um, well, thank you, and we will come back to this. But let me ask everyone right now. This is the time when the future transform, when the guest and I climb down off the stage and mingle with everyone. And the idea here is to discuss a question that has come up. And what I'd like you all to do is to think hard about it. The question is this: where do you see any fertile ground for critical instructional design at your institution? So if you're at a college or university, and of course, if you're at a museum or a public library, do you see any connections for this? Do you see any practitioners who are already thinking along these lines, or do you think you see faculty who are right to participate in a kind of critical instructional design conversation. Where do you see this? How could it possibly unfold? So I'd like you to think about this. And for the next 5 minutes, Amy and I are going to circulate among you. And this is how it works. If you haven't done it before, this works exactly like in the physical world. Instructors or the teachers, the presenters climb off the stage and hobnob with people. If you would like to talk with us, that's fine. Simply click on our boxes as we move around. If you don't want to talk because maybe the mic and camera don't work, or maybe you're just not in the mood or you're shut with it, that's fine. If you want to make sure that you don't get bothered, mouse over your cursor and there's a little button that has a little lock on it. Click that. And that way, nobody can talk to you without your express permission. And if they click on you and you say no, it very politely says no, and that's fine. So for the next 5 minutes, let's move around, talk to each other, groups of 2, 3, or 4, about critical instructional design practice on the institution. Shindig, folks, among the mob. Okay, welcome back. Welcome back, and hello, Amy. Um,
Hi.
we have returned from our sojourn among the masses. And let me ask, what did you guys have to talk about, Amy? What did you find from the participants in the community?
So I had a chance to talk with Vicki Romano, who's in rural Oregon, and she asked me about the difference between the kind of work that you can do when you're quote unquote at the table, and in this case kind of the provost level table, and when you're not. And I talked a little bit about the difference between I guess now you could say I am at the table, and what I've tried to work through in that position is what kind of voice is right when you're at the table, what kind of approach gets things moving forward and helps people uh, come on board with a vision, and what doesn't. And so that's something I've really been kind of working through in my leadership journey, if you will. Um, when I wasn't at the table, I talked a bit about the ways in which we did work to help faculty feel like we were their advocates. And I think that's a different relationship than when they feel like you're their service providers. Um, that can create a certain kind of dynamic, and one that's not particularly conducive to bringing a critical approach. And so what we tried to do at Texas Wesleyan and to some extent at Stanford is to work with faculty for them to feel like we were their advocates. And when you build that relationship, it's a I would say a vulnerable relationship, but one that can be incredibly generative.
Vicky is a longtime foreign activist and always has really, really good questions. And I'm really glad to see that you connected with her. And that is a very practical way of approaching it, in fact. I wanted to share what we can go Cambridge, but we have a question from, let's see, David Ratz, I think. And if we could flash that on the screen, please. So David wants to know, can you give an example, and this is of a course at Middlebury that has benefited from critical instructional design, and describe some of the steps involved? And a very practical question. Thank you, David.
So I would say we're working on establishing what that looks like for us. I mean, we're a fairly new office. I've been there a year. I've been here a year. Sean and Sonia less than that. But I'll give a couple of examples. One, it's not a course at Middlebury per se, but it's a course that kind of generated out of Middlebury programs. We have a graduate program in English, literature, and Rec Comp, the Breadloaf School of English up in the beautiful mountains of Vermont. Out of that comes a Breadloaf Teacher Network, which is a network of teachers who have gone through the program, who share resources, become actively involved in each other's classes, and do some great activist work in their school districts. And there's a program that came out of that called Vermont What's the Story. It's a social action network for middle schoolers and high schoolers in Vermont. I became involved in the project just recently. I mean, just before now third year. But one of the things we did is we provided them with a space on our domain of one's own instance because we wanted to talk about the notion of a community like that of middle schoolers and high schoolers um, developing social action projects and documentaries telling the story of those projects and those topics. We wanted them to be thinking about what it meant to have a space online for those students, and could there be spaces where students have um, agency and ownership of their data, and uh, the opportunity to connect with each other in digital spaces that weren't controlled, that are not controlled by, say, Facebook or Twitter or anything like that. So I've been working with that project, and I would say one of the great joys I've had over the last few months in working on that project is getting to leaders. Tim O'Leary, in particular, and Bill Rich is the other. Tim O'Leary is here locally, and we went to Open Education, the conference last week together, and we just had some really good conversations about what it means to bring a critical approach, including thinking critically about students' participation in these networks, student data, student agency, student voice, and then how to also use all those things to think about getting a social action message out. And those, I think, are ways in which we've approached it. But really, it's about building a relationship, understanding the values of a project and of the people you're working with, and then helping them and bringing questions of, what are we doing here, and how do we get further along the paths, and what assumptions are we making, and things like that.
Well, it's a great project. It reminds me a lot of the Vermont Young Writers Project, where it really emphasizes student voices. And again, it connects with a popular theme, the future transformed, the domain of one's own. We have another question, and I'm just never going to get to mine. But no, I'll get to mine first. I'll be egotistical. I'll serve the host. Steve Smolnick and I were talking about ways that you could see critical instructional design present in faculty. And he pointed out a real interesting problem, which is that long-term persistent faculty, so you think either about tenure-track faculty or faculty on long-term contracts, they're in a really good spot to be able to do this because you can keep nudging them forward month after month, year after year, as they experience more and more, they're in a position to think more and more deeply. The problem being that that's a minority of faculty in the United States and a shrinking minority. So how can we best enable adjuncts to participate in critical instructional design? Which is a vast question. I'm going to spring that on you. And any thoughts about that?
Gosh, that is such an important question. I, to be honest, it's really difficult. Some of the actions I work with care so deeply about the work that they do and their students, and they give above and beyond. They have to put out Herculean efforts to do this work, and they don't get compensated in the way they should. And it's a problem. Like it's a problem. So I think certainly advocacy on their behalf is something that we can try to do. One of the things that I heard in your question and also in Stephen's question that I didn't get to when he asked it before is there's been a trend in education around accountability, this kind of outcomes oriented, not easily measurable, but measurable everything kinds of ways of talking about what faculty do, what students do, and that's an area that I am fortunate to have colleagues who are working with me to push back on. Uh, I could go in a bunch of different directions. I guess I'll say center around what does it mean to use stories and narrative as a way of talking about the things that happen in education and what education means, rather than this kind of strong swing towards computational methods, towards kind of push button input output ways of understanding education. So last week at Open Education, Kate Bowles, Kristen Eshelman, Laura Gogia, Bonnie Stewart, Dave Cormier, gosh, I hope I'm not forgetting one. And I presented about um, um, bringing narratives into research and into the work that we do in higher education. And we've kind of softly launched a Society for Open Narrative Research to help at our institutions for that kind of work and to raise the profile of, of stories and what stories tell us. And maybe that's a place where we can, you know, as the founder of StoryCorps says, listening can be an act of change. Listening can be a way in which we better understand each other. And if that's the case, then we should be figuring out ways to listen to adjuncts. We should be figuring out better ways to listen to students. And maybe those can help us to bring more change into our systems.
The front of the Center for Digital Storytelling website is always listen deeply, tell stories.
Mm.
If you have a minute over the next 2 weeks, can you ping me about this? I'm revising the second edition of my digital storytelling book, and I would love to be able to include something about this in it.
Sure.
We have, friends, we have more questions and comments. Amy has really, really struck a nerve with quite a few of you. This is a major, major topic, thinking about the many ways critical structural design can unfold across education. And again, if you would like to ask a question, either please click the raise hand button to come up on stage or click the orange ask button. We've got one question from Twitter, but George Station has a question. George, is your mic ready? Is your camera ready? Come up on stage.
Hey.
Hello,
Hi,
friend.
hi, Amy. How are you? Great,
I'm
great.
good. How are you?
Okay, so let's see if I can hear. I almost got it down to 140 and coherent, but it's really about what you were saying earlier about love as resistance, and I guess potential consequences of that if we go ahead and follow through with that. And I was also thinking about another conversation that we just got started with this morning, not very deep yet, about potential government and technology company surveillance, if you will, in upcoming administration, depending on who the attorney general is, et cetera, et cetera. So our campus IT networks, as well as our academic technology people, do we cooperate with that? Do we fight it? Do we resist in other ways? What do we do with that potential change in attitude, especially since you noted that Silicon Valley already isn't friendly to us, and we're trying to do domain of one's own or whatever it takes to kind of, stay, control ourselves here. So anyway, that's my question. I'd appreciate your comments on that.
Great question. Um, I think resistance can look like a lot of different things in that question. Yes, I think that we need to be thinking about it from the perspective of our IT organizations. Um, what does it mean when we require students to use specific systems? What does it mean for their data? What does it mean for their ability to control that data? I've been watching pretty much from afar, but very interested in some of the work that's been coming out of the personal API movement. So BYU has been doing some work in this. Adam Kroom at Oklahoma has been working with some students at Georgetown and BYU and others. Kristen Eshelman, Maloney. They've been working around the ability to control one's data and to connect one's data to the services that you need at institutions through personal APIs. And I think that work is so important right now, especially now. And it can be, I think, a form of resistance and one that I'm really interested in looking at. I wrote when I was making some notes earlier today. I wrote a little bit about. I was kind of making some notes about not yetness, and I found a quote from Davis and Samara where they're talking about complexity in education, and we tied sort of not yetness to complexity. And so they say an education that is understood in terms of complexity cannot be conceived in terms of preparation for the future, but rather it must be construed in terms of participation in the creation of possible futures. And one of the things that I worry about with the role Silicon Valley now plays in our educational systems and the surveillance situations that we have is that what we're doing in a lot of cases is putting technology into place that takes away students' ability to participate in the creation of possible futures. And I'm not okay with that. And that is an opportunity for resistance. And I think projects like Domain of One's Own and Personal API give give us the ability to push back. But I'm very concerned that it's not true, but I'm worried that I see more kind of domain of one's own initiatives and personal API initiatives happening at places like Middlebury and not community colleges. I was so pleased last week at Open Education to see a presentation about a domain of one's own initiative at a community college, and I think we can't have that difference in equity. We need students to be able to control their data and have the ability, agency over that at any level, any place, not just places like Middlebury.
That would be great. And you just sparked a thought about the California community colleges when you said that, because of their new online education initiative. Because I know, because it's new, that there are things happening and things forming. So tell you what, let's maybe talk later about that. I think
Sounds
I think
good.
you just said something dangerous there. Speaking of love and resistance, yeah. And not yetness, it's all coming together. Okay, thanks,
Oh,
Amy. Thanks, Amy.
thank you, George.
Let's turn it.
Thank you, George, for asking a great question, which led Amy to some interesting points back further along the line, the questions of equity and politics. We are almost out of time. And I wanted to address a subject you brought up through a Twitter question. And this is from Frederick Graver. Fred, if I'm mispronouncing your name, please, I apologize. He wants to know if you could say a couple of words about what you're learning about remote work. And to frame that, Fred asked about this, and we got some interesting responses. He mentioned that they have two different campuses, so now there's a greater opportunity and a bigger need to do more of that. But also that some other people have mentioned the idea, Ben Harwood mentions, if you're not physically present, I think you're not working. So what are you learning about remote work in this new position?
Um, I will encourage you, since we are kind of short on time, I will encourage you to check out our blog. We've got several posts. One I wrote called Looking Across Distance, where I talk about it from a manager's perspective. And then Sean wrote one called Postcards from Portland about his perspective. And then I wrote one called Advice for Working Across Distance. That is essentially a talk that I gave, a short talk that I gave at a meeting recently. So a couple of the examples of things that we talk about, think about embodiment, think about the way you set up spaces for meetings so that, say, for instance, I had a colleague recently said, the meetings that I participate in, everybody in the room is physically turned towards each other, and I'm like this head hovering above them, and nobody turns to look at me, and if I need to raise my voice to speak up for something, it's actually very difficult to do so. Conversations in meetings like that can become really organically driven by the physical co-location. And so be aware of that. And there are some practices as kind of people who lead that meeting that you can do to make space for remote participants. Sean and I have talked a lot. This is the first time I'm managing anyone remotely. And so I am learning as I go. And I'm so fortunate to have someone like Sean, who I have such a trusting relationship with, such a wonderful relationship with, that we can talk to each other very openly about what each other needs. And when things kind of are at the edge of maybe not going so well, we check in and we talk about it. We use tools, of course, like Slack and um, a Twitter and other tools to connect very closely. But I think you have to really be intentional about it. And my favorite little story about this is that Sean wakes up to work really early for his time, right around him, which is around 10 a.m. our time, and
Mm.
I appreciate that. But it's always about the time that he starts to check in for work that I decide I need a cup of tea, and so I've really started to equate Sean's start of the day with my need to have a cup of tea to the point where I kind of crave it. It's become Pavlovian in a sense. So I know like there's a certain point in the morning where I'm like, oh, I need some tea, and then I know Sean will be starting work any minute now. So you can build stories and you can build experiences that are shared in a way that makes this kind of work together actually kind of special.
Behaviorism work for you? Have you ever used a telepresence robot?
I have not, but my husband has. My husband actually works remotely for Stanford, and they've been experimenting with it. And I have to say, I was a little skeptical. He was too. But he said, the thing that he likes about it the most is that he can actually have some of the serendipitous moments that you would
Mm.
have walking down the hall or stopping by somebody's office or showing up at a meeting um, that he can't normally have. And
They're fun. There's a little one called a QB, which is basically just a camera that you can move around, but and a display. But the advantage is that you can actually, you know, have some kind of, facial contact and some form of attention. Um,
Mhm, mhm.
Amy, I really need to have you come back for a future forum because we need to dive into not yet this. And I think everyone would really like to talk with you about that. We have to go. Let me thank you so much for giving us so much to think about, so much to care about, so many ideas. Thank you so much for your time and for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
No, my pleasure. If you can stick around for a few more minutes, people will be here. But otherwise, I need to, with regret, nudge you off the stage so we can have a slide for next time. Thank you, Amy. So next week, next Thursday, our guest is going to be George Saltzman. He's the Associate Research Professor at Lamar University, focusing on education and leadership. And we have an awful lot to talk about emerging technology and the transformation of education. So please, next week, more from the link there. Uh, Now, there's a lot to cover. Between now and next week, I'll actually be flying to Helsinki, so hopefully I'll be talking to you from a very cold and snowy place. We're also continuing our online book club. We're finishing up reading Madeline Ashby's Wild Company Town. This is our reading has already been written about in Inside Higher Ed. So there's chances for you to finish up this really extraordinary book, thinking about the near future for science fiction. And our next book is coming up soon. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the Future Trends Forum or about the technology that we're using now, Shindig, here are two great links. And if you'd like to stick around for the next few minutes, we'll be here. We thank you all so much for coming and participating, and we thank Shindig for all of your help, and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.